B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, January 25th, 2019. Two big stories today we'll be covering. The 34-day partial shutdown of the federal government is coming to an end. And Robert Mueller has staged another big takedown in front of the cameras as Roger Stone is indicted and arrested in a pre-dawn raid. So news is breaking as I sit down to record the podcast here on this sunny afternoon in California. And President Trump went before the cameras in the Rose Garden just about 90 minutes ago and announced a deal with congressional leaders to temporarily reopen the government. So this is a 3-week end to the shutdown, and the expectation is that Congress is going to work really hard to come up with a deal that the Donald, America's greatest deal maker ever, can sign into law that will advance his idea to build a wall on the southern border along with other border security measures. And, of course, I think this is a victory for the Democrats. I give Nancy Pelosi the greatest credit. Chuck Schumer, he did what he could, but he's kind of a lame guy. And Pelosi just faced down Trump. And even after he canceled her military flight to Afghanistan and Europe, trying to humiliate her, she stayed focused. She didn't really return fire, in a pissing contest. She basically just said, hey, you're not going to have a State of the Union message, and your ego will suffer if you keep this shutdown going. And so Trump, in some ways, kind of declared victory. He said that he has other ways of getting the money for his wall. He's referring to his threat to use emergency presidential powers to commandeer the military and just grab money from other accounts to fund his fantasy. And so the fair deal must emerge before February 15th. Otherwise, he might declare a national emergency, and that, of course, would face legal challenges and a lot of noise. But, he was there on camera trying to present himself as the tough guy who prevailed, even though, of course, he didn't. And we have to credit the 14,000 IRS workers who refused to show up to process tax payments and tax refunds, and the air traffic controllers. Now, I have to say I was getting a little annoyed at the appearance in the corporate media the last few days of advocates for the air traffic controllers and the TSA workers, saying that airport security was at risk and that the whole system could collapse. Well, today, I don't know if that was a fulfillment of the prophecy of the Air Controllers Union, but there were significant slowdowns. LaGuardia Airport had 90-minute delays. They closed off part of LaGuardia to departing flights. Air traffic control facilities near Washington and in Jacksonville, Florida, had low staffing, and that made them slow down the whole process of directing flights in and out of airports. So it does appear that Trump lost big, and that he knows it. Of course, he can never admit that. He never fails at anything. He never regrets anything that he does. But this is the first major setback that the Democrats have been able to deal to Trump since the change of the guard in the House after the midterm elections, and it is encouraging. Now, will they stand firm over the next 3 weeks? Will certain senators cave and try to give Trump his wall? Joe Manchin from West Virginia is the guy who broke ranks to vote with Republicans in some of those bills that were doomed to failure yesterday. I haven't even bothered to report on those because I knew they weren't going anywhere. So we'll see how all this plays out. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, St. Bob Mueller launched another one of his made-for-TV takedowns this morning. At 6 a.m. Florida time, they showed up with 29 armed agents at the home of Roger Stone in Fort Lauderdale, and they took him into custody after scaring his dog and his wife. And what's fascinating is I have read the 24-page indictment proffered by Robert S. Mueller III. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, and I encourage you to check it out yourselves. Because what you'll find is that Roger Stone is being faced with 6 counts of lying to Congress and 1 count of trying to tamper with a witness. Nothing about Russia. Now, the indictment spells out that he was in communication with people who were in communication with people who were in communication with Julian Assange. And the New York Times plays this up as a huge breakthrough. Let me quote from their opening paragraph. Robert S. Mueller III revealed Friday the most direct link yet between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks' parallel efforts to use Democratic Party material stolen by Russians to damage the election campaign of Hillary Clinton. Now today, I'm releasing an in-depth interview that I recorded just an hour ago with the journalist who writes for The Nation, Aaron Mate. And Aaron has had a chance to read some of the coverage, read through the indictment, and he's been one of the clearest thinking skeptics about the Russiagate narrative, painstakingly detailing in his articles at The Nation the deep flaws in the media coverage of what I call this telenovela. So just for example, Aaron and I talk about that opening paragraph, which is based on the unproven contention that the Democratic emails and other materials were stolen by Russians. That has never been proven to any public degree. Now, maybe Mueller has evidence. I understand there's a lot we don't know. But for the New York Times to make that a declarative sentence without any modifiers, alleged, reported, assumed, we think, it is just yellow journalism. It is media malpractice. And so when you boil it all down, what Roger Stone is facing is charges that he lied to Congress. Now, this is a guy who has bullshitted his way through life. He is a self-admitted political dirty trickster. He got his break back with Richard Nixon in the late 1960s. He's been at it ever since. He was an early Trump supporter, but he parted ways officially from Trump before the campaign got fully underway. Yet the allegation is that he was the intermediary, and as you heard in my earlier language, what is being alleged is that Roger Stone communicated through Randy Credico, who is a New York-based reporter. He's heard on Pacifica radio stations, and Credico was in touch with somebody who was in touch with Julian Assange. So these are third and fourth degree connections. And Roger Stone, he gilded the story. He gilded the lily. He tried to make himself more important and more essential than he, in fact, probably was. So he is free on $250,000 bond. He is pledging that he will not testify against his buddy, quote, "There is no circumstance whatsoever under which I will bear false witness against the president, nor will I make up lies to ease the pressure on myself." Now, in addition to Credico, Jerome Corsi, the right-wing hack writer, he promoted the birther meme when Obama was president. He's written for WorldNet Daily. I call it World Nut Daily, and I believe Breitbart as well. Well, he is implicated in this. He is person number one, and Credico is person number two, but they have not been indicted. And Corsi, months ago was speculating that he would be indicted and publicly lamenting that. We do know, and this is a curious point that Aaron Mate points out, that Roger Stone traded emails with Steve Bannon in October. And Bannon was asking if there was more dirt on Hillary in the form of DNC or Podesta emails that were about to come out. And Mate said, well, why would Steve Bannon have to ask Roger Stone if there was high-level collusion with Russia and the Russian government in the Trump campaign? Chew on that a bit as you listen to this excerpt of my in-depth interview with Aaron Mate.
What Stone did, I mean, it's true. He was in contact with Randy Credico, But Rennie Credico wasn't even in contact with Assange. Rennie Credico knows somebody on Assange's legal team, but he didn't even have any inside scoop. I mean, everything that Stone said publicly about what he knew could either be inferred from public statements that Assange had already made, or he was guessing. And, like, for example, it's, like Stone has this famous tweet where he says that it's the Podesta's time in the barrel. Well, so that was taken to mean that Roger Stone knew in advance that Julian Assange had John Podesta's emails. But really, I think the day of or the day before Stone tweeted that, Breitbart had a piece about John Podesta being involved in the same sort of shady financial dealings that Manafort was, And so I think that for example, is what Roger Stone was taking his wild guess from.
Mm-hmm.
And, so it's and this indictment underscores that. I mean, there's no indictment here that Roger Stone conspired with WikiLeaks, relayed any communication from WikiLeaks to the Trump campaign. The only role of the Trump campaign here is that a Trump campaign official, who we now know is Steve Bannon, asked Roger Stone what WikiLeaks had coming up. But Bannon did that after the first releases of emails from WikiLeaks. So like everybody, the Trump campaign wanted to know what was going on. And the fact is they thought, because of Roger Stone's public statements, that he might be able to help them. But we know from the fact that Mueller doesn't allege anything that he couldn't. And also, if the Trump team and Russia were supposedly conspiring, then why is it that Steve Bannon, after the first WikiLeaks emails are released, is asking Roger Stone about it, is asking Roger Stone what he knows?
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Aaron Mate. It's available today for my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, at TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And it's made possible by listeners like you who support my work. Great people like, we'll call him Bill C., because there's one guy named Bill who doesn't want to be fully identified as a subscriber. We'll try to honor your privacy. Also, Susan Lundgren, Jason Ferguson, and Janet Price. They each kick in $5 or $10 a month to support this podcast. You can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. You click on that. Then click on Become a Subscriber. On the sign-up page, you can choose $5, $10, $20 a month PayPal subscriptions, or the $50 annual subscription. And I've still got bonus gifts for you. The CD, the new rock CD by John Dist, is available for those who take out a new annual subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S. And we know that some people don't like PayPal. You can communicate with me directly at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, I'm very concerned about the U.S.-backed rolling coup that we are witnessing in Venezuela. And just before I sat down, I saw an email referencing the courageous independent reporter Abby Martin, who has spent quite a bit of time covering Venezuela over the past couple of years. And she asserts that this is indeed a U.S.-planned regime change of Nicolas Maduro, trading him for this guy who surfaced just a few weeks ago as the new opposition leader in the legislature there, the National Assembly in Venezuela. His name is Juan Guaido, and he declared himself the active president, declared that the office was vacated because Maduro was illegitimate. Now, there was no other process invoked here. There's no international body that has said that Maduro is illegitimate. Just a bunch of people have tweeted it, like Trump and Pompeo in a speech, and Mike Pence, the vice president, in a phone call to Guaido. But this does not pass the fundamental smell test of any kind of a democratic process leading to a change in leadership. And the declarations that Maduro is legitimate are simply assertions by Americans and by some Latin American leaders who have followed the lead of Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Mike Pence to some extent. Most people don't think that Trump gives a shit about Venezuela. Maybe he thinks that liberating its oil reserves might be good for our economy. But beyond that, I don't think he cares. Now, we do understand that the wife of, what's his name, Leopoldo, who is the leading opposition figure, he's under house arrest, that she made a trip to Washington and apparently impressed Trump. And I imagine that she is the conduit for some of what's going on here. Now, we also have an issue where the U.S. has recognized this rogue guy's claim to power. And this is a very dangerous step where the U.S. has taken a risky move that may require follow-up action, including some sort of military intervention. And this is a real serious development in our own hemisphere. Currently, there are about 124 Americans. Some have left. We don't have a total count, but they have left Caracas. But others are staying at the embassy under Trump's order because we are ignoring the order from the state of Venezuela to remove our diplomats. This is another deep violation of standard protocols, and it is something that I believe will blow back on the U.S. eventually. And once again, I need to point out the loaded news coverage that we're seeing. In the Washington Post, for example, today, here is one quote. Let's see. Maduro has stripped the assembly of its powers, but it remains recognized internationally as the only democratic institution in the country. Huh? I mean, this is just bizarre. The lengths that they're going to rationalize and justify a regime change against Nicolas Maduro. And it's fascinating. In the New York Times, columnist Peter Baker has a piece where he criticizes Trump because intervening against what they call Venezuela's strongman belies the America First call. And they say Trump has finally met a strongman he does not like, and he is demanding that the iron-fisted president of Venezuela hand power to his opposition. Now, you can argue about the processes and just how democratic things have been in Venezuela since Maduro took over from Hugo Chavez after he died. And next week, I'm expecting to do a follow-up interview with Dan Kovalik. He is the international elections observer who was in Venezuela last year, and he most recently has been in Nicaragua. He will return next week, and that's when I hope to speak with him and get his perspectives. Baker goes on, quoting Rob Malley, president of the International Crisis Group, the administration's posture toward Venezuela as a foreign policy gamble that in hindsight could look prescient or reckless if that doesn't happen, referring to forcing out Maduro. So then we have Pompeo. I quoted this yesterday. The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate. Now, he is not by any lights the former president. He is a sitting president. And the idea that we can simply say that we don't recognize his legitimacy and therefore he is the former president? I mean, I'd like an international leader to try that on Trump. And then Pompeo thundered, his regime is morally bankrupt, it's economically incompetent, and it is profoundly corrupt. It is undemocratic to the core. And I submit that those words apply to the Trump administration. Incompetent? Just look at the war on the tariff war, the trade war. One observation I have is that the U.S. corporate media is so unaccustomed in recent years to providing honest and objective coverage of crises in foreign countries like Venezuela that they simply adopt the American line. And there aren't a lot of networks or other news outlets that actually have reporters in Venezuela right now, which makes it even more difficult to get honest reporting. And I want to thank Kevin Gostola at Shadowproof for his honest reporting, because he points out that the vast majority of Democrats in Congress are either silent or they support Trump's coup. Now, I would say that this is a departure from the Trumpocalypse, where they oppose virtually everything that he supports, including the recent call to get our troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. Gostola points out that only 3 Democrats, Congressman Ro Khanna, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, and Senator Bernie Sanders, have spoken out about the decision by the U.S. government to give a green light to Guaido and the opposition to oust Maduro. So far, the Democrats who are officially announced for president, including Julian, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, they have nothing to say so far about Trump's effort to take out the established government in Venezuela. Joe Biden is silent. Now, I give credit to Ro Khanna because journalist Rania Khalek tweeted, leading Democrats are backing the Trump administration's right-wing coup in Venezuela. Now would be a good time to hear some opposition. And one of the people she tagged included Ro Khanna from Silicon Valley. His response, let me get this straight. The U.S. is sanctioning Venezuela for their lack of democracy, but not Saudi Arabia? Such hypocrisy. Maduro's policies are bad and not helping his people, but crippling sanctions or pushing for regime change will only make the situation worse. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois said that Trump, the OAS, that's the Organization of American States and other nations, appropriately recognized National Assembly President Juan Guaido as the constitutionally appropriate leader of Venezuela. Come on, Dick. You know better than that. Durbin went to Venezuela last year. I met with Guaido, many of his talented colleagues. They are brave patriots who see a more hopeful and democratic future for the Venezuelan people. And Khanna responded with respect to Dick Durbin, the U.S. should not anoint the leader of the opposition in Venezuela during an internal, polarized conflict. Let us support Uruguay, Mexico, and the Vatican's efforts for a negotiated settlement and end sanctions that are making the hyperinflation worse. Tulsi Gabbard thought about it for a day and then tweeted, the U.S. needs to stay out of Venezuela. Let the Venezuelan people determine their future. We don't want other countries to choose our leaders, so we have to stop trying to choose theirs. And Bernie Sanders, quote, we must learn the lessons of the past and not be in the business of regime change or supporting coups, as we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic. The U.S. has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down that road again. In contrast, Steny Hoyer, the number 2 in the House of Representatives, he's fallen right in line. The Venezuelan people have suffered under the yoke of Chavez Maduro and yearn for a return to democracy. And the suspension of the legitimately constituted National Assembly, the protesters are exercising their right to have their voices heard and take their country back from a tyrant. And I'll point out that Obama and the Democrats were silent when this same kind of process occurred in Egypt. We had a cleanly elected Muslim leader for the first time. And when the military dictator who's now in charge, el-Sisi, helped stage protests that turned into riots across the country, the U.S. claimed that that unrest required the military coup that was never called a military coup. And so it's not just Latin America where we take this outsized view of America's role. And this disgusting editorial in Friday's New York Times. A couple of quotes. That Mr. Maduro must go has been obvious for some time. Since he succeeded the leftist strongman Hugo Chavez in 2013, his mismanagement, cronyism, and corruption, exacerbated by the drop in the price of oil, Venezuela's dominant source of revenue, have brought the country to ruin. The question has been how to pry Mr. Maduro out without a bloodbath. So the Times supports the notion advanced by the most extreme elements, the Boltons, the Pompeos, the Pence, and, Trump. And this is a really, really big setback, in my opinion, to see people fall in line behind an illegitimate regime change adventure in our own hemisphere. One more quote. Guaido, a hitherto little-known engineer with a knack for coalition building, was elected head of the legislature January 5th. He declared the president illegitimate and invoked a constitutional rule that transfers the power to the head of the National Assembly. I mean, this is breathtaking. It really is. I got a little bit more on here. The Guardian quotes John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. The immediate priority is to transfer revenues from the Maduro government to Guaido. Admitted it's complicated. We're looking at a lot of different things we have to do, but that's in the process. And the Guardian says that Guaido reportedly has plans to take control of Citgo, the U.S.-based oil refining subsidiary of the Venezuelan state oil company. And again, this is a rogue regime that he is attempting to start, and the U.S. is backing it. Truly stunning. On to other issues. We're learning how Jared Kushner got to keep his top security clearance despite the objections raised by the FBI background checkers and the CIA officials who weigh in on security clearances for administration appointees. And there was a whole struggle back and forth, and last May, he was granted one of the top security clearances. We learned that this was over the objection of two career White House officials who turned Kushner down for the top secret category. The FBI background checks raised red flags over Kushner's family businesses and his foreign contacts. How about with Mohammed bin Salman? Having rejected Kushner for the clearance, the decision was reversed by Trump appointee Carl Klein, spelled K-L-I-N-E, a former official in the Department of Defense who was put in charge of the Personnel Security Office at the White House 4 months after Trump took office. And not only has he overruled the standard protocols to give Jared Kushner a top secret clearance, he did it in at least 30 other cases. Oh, yeah. I mentioned Tulsi Gabbard has tweeted her opposition to adventures in Venezuela. She has officially announced her run for president in 2020. And I think she's an interesting figure, not perfect. She has a history about gay marriage and about, of homophobia, I would call it. But I think she's past it. And it depends on how voters address the baggage versus the current offerings of a candidate. I'm going to watch her with interest as we see this campaign unfold. And I hope Joe Biden will take my advice and just stay retired. He's currently defending his decision, where last fall he went to Michigan, to Benton Harbor, where he was paid $200,000. That's money that was laundered through a nonprofit. And he gave a speech. And in the speech, he gave a very warm and personal and deep endorsement to a Republican Congressman, Fred Upton. And Upton had helped forge legislation to gut the Affordable Care Act, but Joe overlooked that to say, well, he was an ally of mine in fighting cancer. Now, Biden hasn't addressed the $200,000 speaking fee, which is very unusual during a campaign and where you make political comments. But he's saying, look, I plead guilty to liking Republicans. Okay, well, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Fred Upton, I went out and spoke at an event, and he was there, and I praised him about the fight against cancer. It mattered, saved people's lives, and he stepped up, he and 3 other Republicans. So I acknowledge that, and now I don't know what I am. Well, I know what you are, Joe. You're a buffoon. Barbara Lee, one of the women in Congress I have the deepest respect for. She is the Congresswoman from Oakland, and she has just joined and become co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. And she said, I know people will be laughing about this. Let them giggle all they want. The work is very important. Look at the facts. It's about time. When you look at those whose lives have been shattered by the current laws, it's us. Well, with an attitude like that, I'm glad that she's going to be there to fight for sensible marijuana laws. We need to change the status downgrade it from Category 1 under the Drug Enforcement Act. And we need to create banking structures for the commerce about cannabis that is occurring in states that have legalized it for medical or adult use. Hopefully that'll come in my lifetime. In a courtroom yesterday, Huey Burton, who spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was paroled 10 years ago, and he's finally been declared innocent. He was fully exonerated because he was convicted of killing his mother when he was just 16. And he was the subject of a false confession. And he's not alone. Jeffrey Deskovic was at that hearing where the exoneration was pronounced. And if you go to the peterbcollins.com, enter Jeffrey Deskovic in the search window, you'll pull up my podcast interview with him from last summer, where he talks about his own case of being falsely convicted based on a false confession that was extracted from him. Today, the U.S. border folks have announced that they are going to enforce the new rules related to asylum seekers. You cannot enter the United States. You must take a number and wait on the other side of the border. I believe this is completely illegal, and you can be sure that it will be litigated. Over at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg has announced plans to integrate all of the messaging services of the operations he controls. So Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger, and WhatsApp will all be combined into one app. And I'll be curious to see how this plays out, because earlier this week, WhatsApp announced a restriction on how many people you can forward a message to. And I believe this, I don't have evidence, but I believe this was pressure from Brazil, because WhatsApp is extremely popular. It is the most common text messaging platform in Brazil, and the new dictator there, Jair Bolsonaro, I think, put pressure on Facebook to restrict that. And finally today, Amazon has got to come to its senses. Now, I don't use online shopping that much, but during the holidays, we got a lot of packages, and many of them from Amazon, and it was kind of like a treasure hunt. They wouldn't bother to bring them to the front door. They'd just scatter them along the driveway and in the bushes. But one of the things that I've noticed is that they over-package things. You'll get a little item, and it's in a really big box. And there's huge waste in the packaging and the cardboard. And a recent op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle noted that the market for recycled cardboard has collapsed. And so Amazon is flooding the nation with more cardboard than we can possibly recycle. I hope they'll take a look at that and fix it. And finally, several of the world's biggest consumer products companies are testing out new ways of using refillable and returnable containers for some leading brands. Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Pepsi, Coke, Nestle, and Danone are among the names signing up to run a test program. And the idea is that you can reuse the containers that many of these products come in. That would be a smart way to try to reduce that big Pacific garbage patch, wouldn't you say? Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide, even in Russia. And you can find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.